them speak directly to having a conversation, but then moving that conversation forward by finding people who are also saying either I'm having this conversation already or I'm looking for this conversation. It's about finding those folks, tapping them on the shoulder and saying, all right, I'm creating this space where we can now actually talk about things. And I think the town hall is a good start, but I think a lot of things need to happen locally. I think more local city councils. I wish that more even more churches and nonprofits to take a more active role in helping educate voters, getting people to the polls, because the only way to undo sort of these systemic issues, because racism is a systemic issue, sexism is a systemic issue, prejudice against LGBTQ plus folks, that's a systemic issue. There are things that are in place that actually regulate those folks to a place of a second class citizen. So you can't say that those things aren't systemic because they're right there. So how do you go into those places? How do you change that narrative when there still is this is a hypothetical question. I don't expect you to answer, but the question kind of is, how do you step into a space where you have to convince someone like Marco Rubio to not take another donation from the NRA? I think it was so beautiful when that child, the kid put him on the spot. He put him on the spot and he said, will you tell me right now that you won't accept another donation from the NRA? And those are the types of things that brave space that you invite people into. That's the stuff when you do all of the things that we've kind of been talking about, when you get to a point where you have had enough, or where you've seen enough, where you've experienced enough, you come up with just these very basic questions. And the youth in Florida are answering the basic questions that I think need to be asked about all of the other systemic things that we have in our problem, gun control being one of them, but also asking about politicians who take donations from groups that are known to be prejudiced towards African Americans, or taking groups that are known to put in legislation that incarcerates minorities at a greater rate than other demographics. It's really getting in and asking those simple, basic questions. But what I love about your work is you help break down the simple questions, because I think oftentimes there is there's almost an oversight of some of these questions to make them think like, oh, we actually don't have a race problem, or we don't have a gun problem. That's a lot of the narrative that I see online is, well, we don't have a gun problem, it's this type of problem. It's like this is the most frustrating analogy, because how can you I don't know. Anyway,
so here's the thing about what you're saying, right? And it actually speaks to my next writing project.
Oh, great.
So my next writing project, the working title right now is "Do Justly," is the title, and the subtitle is "Create Equity." Creating equity, not convincing skeptics.
Wow.
So creating equity, not convincing skeptics. I think what ends up happening is we spend a lot of time trying to get everybody else on board. We spend a lot of time trying to get everybody else on board. And once we can get everybody on board, then we can make change to the inequity that exists. And the problem with that logic is, first off, nobody got everybody else on board to create the inequity.
Yep.
Right. Like nobody took a vote and said, how many of y'all want to be enslaved? Raise your hands.
Yeah.
Right. Like no one did that. How many women want the right not to be self-determining and have some other person decide what you do with your body and when you get pregnant and when you know how that works? And no one did that. No one did that work. Right. But we think to do wrong, you get to be a small little coalition of the determined. And to do right, you got to be everybody in the world.
It's an impossible mission.
Right? It's an impossible mission, which is why the work doesn't get done. Right? That's first off. Secondly, the notion of convincing skeptics is the work of salvation. Right? And it's good, important work.
Yeah.
It's good, important work. And we approach it differently, whether we're conservative or we're liberal. If we're falling on that spectrum, like the way we do salvific work might be different, but it's still salvific work, right? Like conservatives will be upfront and call it, saving souls,
Right.
whereas liberals will call it education.
Mm.
But it's still towards the same end of, I need to bring you on board.
Yeah.
But once I get you on board, the problem still exists.
Yeah.
And we know there's a gap between the ability to care about a problem and the ability to do a problem, do something about it. Like we know there's a huge gap. They aren't one and the same. They aren't close. One doesn't automatically make the other more likely or more possible, right?
Yeah.
And so this business of doing equity, what does it mean to do justly, create the equitable situation? So, it's not too often that I agree with our former president, George W. Bush.
Yeah.
But when he coined this language, whoever coined this form in the speech where he first said it, the coalition of the willing.
Yeah.
Those are folk you need to work with.
Right.
Those are the folk I work with, right? Like, so often I'm being engaged by an existing community that already has said this must not be anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't have all the answers. And in fact, when we start getting into answers, we kind of fall back into our entrenched kind of ways, historic ways of parsing this thing out. Right. So it becomes gun control versus First Amendment rights or Second Amendment rights. Right.
Right.
Even though that nomenclature is totally beside the point of the conversation these youth are trying to have.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't even bring in their language.
It doesn't even, but that's the language we have. And so we fall back into that, and we fall back into our ideologies, and we fall back in. And so it's, hey, let's forget that. Let's be the coalition of the willing. And then my job is to give you enough distance from the conversation as it's historically had to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, so that then you can start to imagine new possibilities.
Yeah.
You can start to, as I sometimes say, try on new stories, new stories and new scripts, new ways of thinking and new ways of doing. You can try them on. You can decide together what pieces of this thing you want to be a part of the new world you want to create together before you assign an ideology to it. And then you can pursue that thing instead of protecting your ideologies and your belief systems and your notions about other people's intentions and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the work.
Yeah, and I think it's so beautiful how you naturally invite people to look into their blind spots, because I think that's really what a lot of what I'm hearing you say, an important part of any sort of justice work or social work comes from people who they have to say enough. It's hard enough to do justice work without convincing people that they need to do it. But I think there's a strong component of people just that are saying that they're finding their groups. They may have been saying, I don't believe in this. That's kind of how I was. I was kind of like, I don't believe in a lot of these things. I kind of felt like I was this lone voice. And so I had to go find these other voices that were saying the same things and having the same conversations as me. So there's that point, there's that self-sufficient part of it, but also what you have gone before folks and what you have gone before them to do is to help create a space for people who maybe don't have the strength or the resources to be as self-sufficient as other people are in their journey. Because how we get to this point where we wake up to who we could be, whenever you get to that point, whatever that morning looks like for you, to use that analogy of waking up, this one morning, and I want to talk more, this will be a nice transition into your book, but once we get to that point where we wake up, I think there's a lot of questions. For me, there was a lot of questions. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of doubt. So you wrote an entire book about how we can be better and how we can wake up to who we could be. And, I read the first couple of chapters, thanks to Google, and was totally hooked because I love how you start out with this story of it kind of has this person talking about their beliefs and what they know, and then how that they have to act a certain way because they know that. So I'd love for you just to kind of unpack that story a little bit more, and maybe just walk us through maybe how you can help people see outside of that perspective.
So, one of the keys to this work, either whether we talk about the facilitation work I'm doing or the work I do around story within Better, is linked to what we define as enough and what we say enough to. Right. So I love that you name that enough. If we try to have a story about have a conversation about our beliefs, well, all of a sudden we start in two different places.
Right.
Because no one holds anything exactly the same way.
Yep. Right.
My wife and I have been married for, it'll be 23 years this year, and we have known each other for 28 years. Wow. So the majority of our lives, we have known each other. And we have talked through almost everything in the world.
Yeah. I mean, you have kids.
and solved all the world's problems 10 times over.
Yeah.
Right? But even then, as much as who I am is shaped by who she is in these conversations and doing life together for 28 years, even then, we do not hold everything exactly the same way. I'm not even sure we hold most things exactly the same way, right? Yeah. So if we start with what are our beliefs? What are our core values? We automatically start apart from one another, which is not a bad thing. It's just not useful to getting to do.
Right.
Right.
Well, and you also don't know the gap. You don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you don't know the gap of where someone else is. It could take you a long time to close that gap. So
exactly. So if closing the gap is the business, if that's the work you're about, be about that work. But just know that is not the same thing. Once you've taken all those years to close that gap, that is not the same thing as creating equity in the world.
Yep.
Two different things. So where I try to start with that enough business is, and where I think we should start, is saying enough to the impact. I have had enough of watching children die. I have had enough of watching people of color suffer under systems of inequity and embody that colonization in themselves.
Yeah.
And all the unhealthy outcomes that happen when you buy that the supremacist logic of they deserve to be on top, which means I deserve to be somewhere else.
Right.
Right. So I'm tired of of these results, these negative, harmful impacts.
Yeah.
When you can say enough to that, now we can do work. When we can both say enough to that, to kids being killed in schools, now we can do work. And what we believe doesn't really matter.
Right.
Because the truth is, what we know from brain science is we don't believe, then do.
Yeah.
Brain science and history teaches us that what we do is we do, and then we backfill the rationale.
Yeah. We make excuses, we justify, whatever.
Justify. I mean, you can aggregate any bits of information, block out any bits of information that you don't want to entertain in order to create a rationale for what you did. And that simple truth makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And whether or not we have to keep having these same conversations forever in a day, or we can do something about it.
Well, and what I love about your book is your book invites these conversations, and it invites a better conversation, and it's not even it's more imaginative. It doesn't even, because you do have a spiritual background, and that is one component of your work, but your work your work wasn't titled better, how the church can become better, how we can be better Christians, how whatever. It says waking up to who we could be, meaning anybody, meaning any person